Today we're going to be looking over Chapter 16, the decentralization of industry. Now, we should say there is an asterisk at the title here, and he oh my gosh, okay. And he is expanding, or at least I should say truncating here, his ideas, which are written in the book Fields, Factories, and Workshops, which was a book which he published apparently in 1912. So this book, or excuse me, this chapter is a bit of a shrunken down version of stuff where he makes more extensive arguments somewhere else. And I think that that's going to be kind of apparent as we go through it. It'll be clear, how that sort of makes sense. Now, last time around, we met these, I suppose, like mega scientists, these scientists who are going to understand, who are going to study the needs of humanity and also the best way to allocate them. And that these people, I suppose, were going to be the kind of people who adjudicate disputes, figure out how resources are properly allocated. Again, Kropotkin being very interested in developing a scientific approach to the study of society. That seems to be his general sort of what he's going to. But one of the things you'll notice about that idea in and of itself is it contains this idea of a kind of unified science, that things aren't ultimately going to contradict or sort of conflict with one another. Because one of the obvious and most apparent things you'll notice when you think about that idea for just a few seconds is the idea here that what if social needs also exist, right? There's social needs, and then there's also kind of biological needs. And so imagine you're trying to develop a science which, determines the sort of biological needs, whatever they may be, for humans. There's also going to be social needs. And so it turns out that the way in which you try to allocate those needs actually might interfere with your ability to allocate the kind of social needs which people have. One of the major complaints under capitalism as it currently exists is that it requires people to maybe move away from where they grew up at, that, traditions can't be really maintained, that the kid moves away from the family and then has to spend years in a new place where they may not really want to be, and that can lead to kind of social alienation, social isolation, and so my point being, though, that Kropotkin just seems to think that this wouldn't be the case, that there is a sort of unity in our knowledge in a certain way, that, if we know the best way, if we know everything about the world and understand things, we'll also know the best way to live and the best way to really arrange our society. And I think we're going to see that idea, that sort of meta theme carried through quite clearly in his ideas here in Chapter 16 on the decentralization of industry. I think that he's going to sort of hone in a little bit more into that in our final chapter in Chapter 17. We'll have to see. That's just sort of what I'm anticipating. But going into the very beginning of Chapter 16, he opens up with this idea of how Britain was initially. That initially, after the Napoleonic Wars, actually, I'll just read the quote, the opening lines here to Chapter 16. He says, quote, "After the Napoleonic Wars, Britain had nearly succeeded in ruining the main industries which had sprung up in France at the end of the preceding century. She had become the mistress of the seas and had no rivals of importance. She took in the situation and knew how to turn it to her privileges and to the advantage and bring those advantages to account. She established an industrial monopoly and imposing upon her neighbors her prices for the goods she alone could manufacture, accumulated riches upon riches." This goes back to earlier ideas, how Kropotkin thinks that certain kinds of monopolies are based upon exploitation and oftentimes aspects of colonialism, that, you're able to charge a specific price. But one of the things that I think is sort of interesting here, Chris, and you can tell me what you think about this, is that, he's telling us a story in a certain way, but he's not really giving us maybe a kind of argument that seems to be clear and rigorous. Because, you take that section, he tells us how Britain was, and then he seems to say that just sort of necessarily, mechanically, it turned out that Britain lost her relative advantage. Other countries started to rise and, they saw their turn and the like. and that Kropotkin seems to think that this is like a necessary trend for the decentralization of industry. Britain was at this high established place, and then eventually she lost her competitive advantage, and he seems to think that this is a just necessary feature of human history. But he doesn't really give us any arguments. I mean, is that something that you observed as well in the first part?
Yeah, I mean, I found this chapter to be very descriptive and less prescriptive, where he's going through and he's talking about, he definitely makes the case that things should be decentralized because he uses the word monopoly a number of times. Once you have someone who's in control of a certain area, then they can, of a certain, say, industry, then they can actually control neighboring countries and stuff if you're not decentralized, right? So he goes through and gives numerous cases where some countries or areas were able to, I guess countries in his examples that he's given, able to sort of free themselves or bringing about a freedom to themselves by, and by freedom, I mean freedom from, sort of the oppression of this monopoly he talks about some countries started manufacturing their own silk rather than, buying silk from the one country that was really good at silk.
Specifically France, right?
Yeah, so sort of taking back the power that way by decentralizing things. And he definitely talks about a situation where, you should try to do as much in-house, sort of quote unquote in-house as you can, where, and this is much later in the chapter, but it's not a very long chapter. He talks about, it's foolish indeed to export wheat and import flour, to export wool and import cloth. So it sounds like he's really trying to set up a situation where you are in more control when you handle all of the steps along the way, and you don't have to worry about what some other country is going to do along the way with things.
Right, and it's a kind of biological analogy all the way back in I'm not sure if it was chapter 4 or 5, but it was the chapter on food. He introduces to us this idea of the integration of functions, arguing that society must necessarily go this way. Again, this is an analogy to how he thought that sort of evolution occurred at the time. Again, Kropotkin sort of modeling after the work of Darwin in many respects, thinking that, you have these different functions that exist, whether it's, sort of receptors on a species that, can receive light and, different tactile sensors that then eventually they begin to integrate towards a singular task, and that's when the species sort of really takes off. Now, modern evolutionary theorists don't make this sort of clear-cut thing that they did back in the day, although there is still like a general idea of the integration of functions. And we saw this in the criticism, specifically in Kropotkin's criticism of the division of labor, really bringing that in. That, like this division of labor leads to a kind of disjointed self that you can't really develop as a whole individual if you, only really are able to focus on one group. And so Kropotkin, in a certain sense, again, really carrying through that kind of analogy to the individual nations. And we saw it a little bit last time around, but now he's really kind of bringing it in more clearly, saying that, if you're only doing one type of industry, one type of craft, you're not actually going to be able to, first of all, you won't be able to take down capital. You won't ever be able to properly succeed. We see that a little bit more in part 3. But he thinks ultimately that, especially nowadays with contemporary and modern day agriculture, again, referring to when Kropotkin was writing, you actually need to have machines. You actually need to have factories in order to be able to plow the lands properly, that you can't just go out and sprinkle stuff on the ground, with your bag of seeds and walk through and farm it anymore. No, you actually need to have a kind of industrial agriculture in order to support the population. And so Kropotkin thinks that that's the stage of evolution in society that we're on right now, which is we're beginning to integrate our functions. We've divided our labor, but now every single area needs to come together and have all the proper, means in order to, have a sort of more flourishing society.
Yeah, and I mean, he definitely wants to see things decentralized. And I don't know how that would work in today's society. I think he hit the nail on the head, because even more now than in his time, you need the advancements that we've made in agriculture in order to go out and, you think of our major cities. In order to feed the millions of people in these major cities, you're going to have to use all the tools that you can in order to create that that kind of food there. So the science would be important. And, then you're not at the mercy of someone else. If you're making the steel that then goes in to make the machinery, that then goes in to produce the food, to process the food, to make it into flour and all that kind of stuff, that's then you sort of can respond to the needs of a community quickly because you're doing it in-house. I think sounds to me like he would be horrified at today's situation where everything is sort of shipped everywhere to the point where we're literally shipping bottles of water around the country and around the world, when it's, I would love to hear what he would have to say on the idea of shipping water around when it's just sort of not
he would
necessary
absolutely think that that's absurd. I mean, he brings up the idea that, you waste resources by transporting a thing, and so it's not really rational. I don't know that, like, deductively that's sort of like his central argument. I think he sort of brings that up as a point,
right?
Like, hey, it also has this negative side effect as well, so be mindful of that. But it's definitely the case that he's clearly against the idea. And again, when we get to part 3, he focuses in on how it's actually going to be impossible to truly be able to ever achieve any kind of revolution if we don't have our functions properly integrated, or at the very least, if we ever did have a revolution, it would absolutely force us to integrate our functions, and we'll do it very, very quickly because our true needs will become apparent. So again, sort of part 2, I'd say, well, part 1, he's really kind of going through historically, sort of in his time, how industries are sort of developing. He talks about the development of industry in Germany, that even just 50 years ago, as of when Kropotkin was writing, Germany was essentially a tributary state or fragment of states. They'd just be, sending in resources to these larger countries in Britain and in France, but that now Germany has begun to develop an industry, an industrial capacity, allowing it to produce for itself. He specifically also brings in the United States, saying that the United States has reached a true level of capacity now in this century that it, has I don't know that he uses the word surpassed, but saying that, like, it's completely outside of the tutelage of Great Britain. Pat Irwin, we are referencing Peter Kropotkin's The Conquest of Bread. That's what we're chatting about today. This is the book club for The Conquest of Bread with Peter Kropotkin. I kind of lost my train of thought there, but in general, yes, he thinks that, he thinks that, like, these different countries, these different societies are developing industries and are developing their own capacities because of the fact that, he says here, quote, capital taking no cognizance of the fatherlands. He also specifically references how knowledge does not know any borders. I couldn't find that quote right in front of me, but I know that he says it in either part 1 or part 2, that, like, these ideas spread across borders. And so ultimately everything is going to necessarily become integrated. It's not only the case that this is the right way to do it, it's the case that it will do it, that history demands it, which is, of course, a stronger claim requiring more evidence. It's unclear how rigorous he's giving us that. But again, this book is an outline. I think that that's, like, a pretty important thing to stress. He's giving us an outline for how we should think about developing a scientific account of society, specifically a kind of biological or scientific account of society, at least as he saw science in his day.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. I mean, sort of going taking a bit of a turn there. So I feel like one of the points he makes, and then he doesn't really go in depth with it, but I think there's a little bit of a hint of that there, is where he talks about colonies and the fact that a lot of trade, like, part of the reason that we set up these colonies was for trade, to basically make the country who is in charge of the colonies can do very well. The capitalists can do very well for themselves. They can make a lot of resources for themselves, not necessarily to the benefit of the colonies themselves. And so I think there's kind of a hint there that a lot of times trade is used as a weapon. And you could argue that in modern society, trade is oftentimes used, to forward the capitalist agenda, that kind of stuff in much the same way as he's talking about here. We just don't necessarily do it in the same manner that we did before, but this idea that by shipping all our goods around and making them super cheap and having other people buy them, is a form of control, right? Which he's obviously not very, very. He's not for people controlling other people.
And we get another allusion just a few pages in to chapter or to part one of this chapter here. Again, an allusion to his criticism of pseudoscience and how he thinks about the nature of pseudoscience, specifically in the realm of colonialism. He says here, quote, "We all know the theory. The great European nations need colonies because colonies send us raw materials, carbon, cotton, fiber, unwashed wool, spices, etc. to the motherland, and the motherland, under the pretense of sending them manufactured wares, gets rid of her damaged stuff, her machine scrap, iron, and everything which she no longer needs or has any use of. It costs her little to nothing, and nonetheless the articles are sold then for exorbitant prices." Such was the theory, such was the practice for a long time in London and Manchester's, and fortunes were indeed made while India was ruined. In the India Museum in London, unheard of riches collected in Calcutta and Bombay by English merchants are to be seen. And, again, I think that this is a kind of allusion, especially given what he says a few lines up, kind of to his criticism of kind of pseudoscience, that, his general idea that we've sort of been following the past couple chapters, that, in more what we might call complex sciences, or what Kropotkin thinks of as complex sciences like sociology, people tend to just, stick to an example of something working. And then they generalize that example. They find one instance of a pattern in a whole set, and they're like, this must be the pattern for the entire thing. And so then they overgeneralize it. And so, here again, Kropotkin giving an example of the theory, I think, meant to highlight that specific weakness of colonialism, right? That, like, yes, it may be the case that, it creates this seemingly natural cycle of, there's the European nations and they need this thing. So then the colony sends it, et cetera, et cetera. But in doing that kind of pseudoscience and taking out that simple pattern, you remove all the complexity, mentioning there how India was ruined. Also talking about this museum that has all these stolen items from India. And so, that kind of attempt of pseudoscience, or people who think, I will say, I think that he's generally right. I think that it could be said a little bit more nuanced, but I don't know that this is exactly, like the task of this particular book. But like, I do think that it is right. Like, whenever we talk about really complex things, or, seemingly obscure things, like, people think that, like, oh, well, that means that there's no answer, therefore any answer is acceptable, or that there's no means of judging those answers. And so here's an instance. Let me just use that instance and then expand it to everything. And that might be useful for helping think through a problem, but then to sort of advance that as like the end all be all can lead to a kind of problem. And I think that right there, what we see from Kropotkin is sort of bringing out his criticism of pseudoscience and kind of using it. I don't know that. Yeah, it's analytically in a certain way, like using that to expose colonialism for what it is, or at least how he sees it, as just an instance of pseudoscience. It's, we all know that theory. And I think that I think that it's generally right, at least on that count.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a good point that gets made there. And then in part 3, so I know I'm kind of jumping around here.
Yeah. Yeah. What were you gonna say?
Oh, was there more in part 2 you wanted to go or discuss?
That was still part 1, but
was it?
I mean, there's still. I'd say for the rest of part 1, he really focuses on some of the weaknesses of colonialism. It might be worth asking nowadays today, given our society that we're in nowadays, whether or not the direct criticisms of colonialism always and entirely overlap with the criticisms of globalism, right? Like, it could be very tempting to take these criticisms of colonialism and then just directly import them over to globalism. And certainly it's the case that globalism as it exists today has a lot of relics and artifacts from colonialism, but there's also a lot of new oppression which emerges from our new system, which might not be entirely explained through an analysis of colonialism. And Kropotkin here, writing when he's writing, is lumping in this criticism of capitalism with this criticism of colonialism, which of course made sense because capitalism was entirely, like 100%, a colonialist enterprise at the time, and in many respects it still is. But I do think that there might be new criticisms, new concerns which have emerged since. Mm-hmm. Some other criticisms may have gone away, and so it might make sense to sort of read this cautiously and not sort of over extract from part 1 of chapter 16 of his book.
Yeah, it certainly
If
takes a
that makes sense.
nuanced look because, like you said, a lot of it carries over. But if the rules of the game are changed, then obviously some of the goings on in the game are going to change as well and take on a new face at the very least. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if you wanted to bring in what you were going to say about part three, but in part two, it's pretty straightforward. There's not like a ton that goes on in part two, other than this one interesting point where he's talking about the spread of knowledge. This is sort of what I was alluding to, kind of bringing up a little bit last time. Just one example here. He talks here how, quote, chemical industry is no longer an English monopoly. Sulfuric acid and soda are now made even in the Urals. Steam engines made in, is that Winterthur? I'm not sure where that is, have acquired everywhere a wide reputation. And at the present moment, Switzerland, which has neither coal nor island, nor iron, nor seaports to import them, has nothing but excellent technical schools, makes machinery better and cheaper than in England. So ends the theory of exchange. And so I think that there's a really interesting idea here about how the spread of knowledge is finally more important than these capitalist or materialist, deterministic factors. That, actually, it turns out that people can be well trained. You give them excellent technical schools, as he says in the case of Switzerland, and they can build the best watches. They can build the best things, even though maybe they didn't have the sort of natural distribution of coal or iron that you might think would lead them to forcing them to be a certain way. Well, actually, he says, the spread of knowledge is far more important. That, you teach people, you give them the right kind of education, and you can do just about anything. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's good because the truth is we now, even now, or especially now, I should say, more than ever, the ability to transfer information is easy, right? If there's someone in another part of the world and we want to give them information, it's easy. Here you go. I just send it to you in an email or I post it online or whatever, and you have that information. So I think it goes a lot to his point here where he makes in here somewhere, and why should India not manufacture? What should be the hindrance? Capital, but capital goes wherever there are men poor enough to be exploited, right? Knowledge, but knowledge recognizes no national barrier. So he's saying, right, so you can, the capital is this limiting factor, but the knowledge can kind of go wherever. And so that as long as the capital is kind of the thing getting in the way of everyone being able to just say, oh, look, the information is out here about how to make watches. Let's all make, good watches or whatever.
Yeah, Public Citizen in my chat here saying that it sounds very optimistic. I think you're right. I think that you're definitely right that could even be a possible concern about Kropotkin. We opened this up, our conversation up today, by discussing how his concept of science seems to have this unified sense, this generally Western, I would say, idea that knowledge and virtue are in some way symmetrical, right? Like if you really understand how the world works, you're also going to know how to properly live your life, whether that's, you'll understand how to best avoid people, when they're about to get upset because people are predictable, or, some other theory of virtue. It seems that Kropotkin, at the end of the day, really does think that, if you really understand scientifically how society works, how people really work, you're going to be able to make a really good society. And maybe that's true. I'm not here saying that that's absolutely wrong. I think that, in fact, I would say I probably lean to that idea. I'd say I'm skeptical for epistemic reasons that we can ever achieve that kind of knowledge. But he seems to be very optimistic that we are capable of achieving that knowledge.
Yeah. And
And that might be a question that you could, I think, legitimately ask Kropotkin. Hold on, are you really sure that, this level of knowledge is really, really, truly possible? For sure. I think that you are right to point out here that it does sound maybe a tad optimistic, on the tad optimistic side of things. One of the quotes that he brings up at the end of part two, I'm sorry if were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, to that point, I think there's a limit, like a limiter on, when you're sound design or whatever, there's a point at which you're not going to get too high, because the idea that we're going to make this utopia and everyone's going to be happy, probably not the case. But as far as being able to manufacture things and being able to be industrious, that information can be given all over the world and shared if we're not trying to keep it to ourselves because we want to get all of the capital, right? It's like, okay, well, here's an emerging company. Let's share some of the knowledge with them. And it still seems like the capital is the thing that keeps things from moving forward. So while I would sort of lean in this direction, I certainly don't think that like once you put that into place, everyone's problems are suddenly instantly solved, right? There's still going to be some trying to figure out how to make society work even with this in place.
Yeah, I think that it's obviously it's a difficult thing. I mean, I think Kropotkin would say that again, this book is meant to be a very general blueprint about how we could make such a science that would begin to answer these questions.
Yeah.
You could ask whether or not his approach to science is legitimate in that respect, but I think that that's at least what he's sort of up to. One of the quotes that I found quite interesting at the very end of part 2, the last paragraph of part 2, he says here, quote, agriculture can only prosper in proximity to factories, and no sooner does a single factory appear than an infinite variety of other factories which must then spring up around it, so that mutually supporting and stimulating one another by their inventions, they increase their productivity. This is really interesting because, I mean, again, idea of integration of functions. I feel like, we have to preface that throughout throughout the entire book so far, since he brought up the idea, because he's really making this as a kind of argument from analogy in that way. But, again, he seems to think that, like, because of the fact of how agriculture is, or because of how factories are, like essentially agriculture now requires the development of factories, but one factory is going to require all these other factories in order to make all the parts, which is going to require all the other parts, and all the workers are going to need to be clothed, and all the other, and it is true, right? Like, we actually do see something of this sort when, when a company moves in to a particular area. There's lots of gentrification, but we also do see other jobs start to move in, because it turns out people move in, and then you got to provide for those people. They want different kinds of services and the like. It can take a very long time for stuff like that, and oftentimes it is done at the expense of the poor, where they sort of get pushed out of their communities, or put into subjugating roles when previously maybe they owned a mom and pop shop. But I think that there is something at least generally correct about the idea that, once you create one factory, you create a whole lot of other ones. And he thinks that, this necessary feature, which I think he's going to more so argue for in part 3, although he kind of did already, that, because of how agriculture is nowadays, you get one factory, you're going to get more factories, and you're going to get more and more factories. And you're going to have a kind of ripple effect. And again, the must is, I think, the important part. He's not just telling us what should happen. Kropotkin is telling us what must happen. He says specifically, again, reading that quote, and no sooner does a single factory appear than an infinite variety of other factories which must, in my version of the book, I don't know if it's the same for yours, Chris, it has must italicized there, like it just absolutely must spring up around it. I think Kropotkin loves to do things like this, say that it must happen, it absolutely must. But what were we going to say?
I think there's a logic to it. Like, once you have your basic resources met, then people can live there, right? So, and food is one of those. So once you put agriculture someplace, you now have food taken care of. So people can go, okay, it's safe to go there because there's food. But then as soon as people are there, they need other things. They need to have what's going to happen to their kids while they're at work all day. So then a daycare industry pops up, and then schools, and all sorts of stuff, stores and machinery, and there's all this stuff to just sort of support everything. But if you can't supply food in an area, then all of a sudden it's very difficult to support stuff. So once the resources are there, it's like mold on a piece of bread. Once it starts, it's going to sort of spread and spread,
it's because
keep
that's going.
Just what it does. Yeah.
Yeah, and so going into part 3, then he opens up, and I know, Chris, you already read this quote, but I think that it's a good way to sort of kick off part 3, which I suppose is why he wrote it. He says, "It is foolish indeed to export wheat and to import flour, to export wool and to import cloth, to export iron and to import machinery, not only because transportation is a waste of time and money." Again, not only, that's not the crux of his argument, because it's a waste of money, but above all because a country with no developed industry inevitably remains behind the times in regards to agriculture. because a country with no large factories to bring in steel in finished condition is doomed to be backwards in all other industries. And lastly, because the industrial and technical capacities of the nation remain underdeveloped if they are not exercised in a variety of different industries. And so, I think that we do see this sort of thing pop up around around the world, where like if you don't ultimately diversify your kind of industry, it becomes more and more difficult to diversify further, because learning one technical trade or learning multiple different kinds of trades can help you then learn how to develop other trades, or develop, studying clearly in one one science, having experts who really understand a science in an area can help, solve the particular problems where it regards implementation in other countries. One of the things that he talks about in this particular chapter, or actually it could have been the last chapter, I'm not actually sure. No, it's definitely this chapter, where he talks about some of the problems when it came to India, for example, where, the factories, when they first came out, they weren't particularly productive because the humidity was different, because they had all these different kinds of unique problems, in that those problems had to be solved before the country could be ultimately productive. Right? That, the humidity was different, the temperatures were different, so the factories worked different, and these different things had to be adjusted. So you need to have experts, you need to have people on the ground who can really understand and think through these particular problems. And that ultimately, in Kropotkin's idea, they require, I'm sorry, I got distracted by someone's chat there, but ultimately in Kropotkin's idea, the workers should be the ones who are really making these decisions, because they're here on the ground, and that they are the ones who really understand how things are going. That, you need to have that kind of diversity, not only within the general sphere of things, but also within the workers themselves, that they should be working with their hands, that they should also be working with their heads. Because again, going back to what we discussed in our last discussion, that, you become like a child, as Kropotkin puts it, if you aren't also educating yourself and aren't also sort of reading the books and understanding things. But then on the other hand, you won't be able to truly if you're just a theorist and you don't truly understand the situation of the workers, then your theory is completely useless, because you won't properly understand what's going on for the vast majority of people. You're going to be engaging in what Kropotkin called, way back in sort of the beginning of the book, a kind of bourgeois theory, or middle class theorist, right? And that this is particularly problematic, and it's certainly a trap that a lot of people can kind of fall into, I suppose.
Right. And one of the things he kind of gets at, he doesn't even go I would say he doesn't go terribly far into detail, but he kind of gives this idea in the third part that it's like he's really putting an emphasis on how much things will change during a revolution. So he's kind of calling out that people think there'll be this revolution and then everyone's just going to go back to work the next day. And he's kind of calling out how much things have to change. And it's not exactly clear to me. I guess he's just sort of putting up a warning flare and saying, look, when the revolution does happen, there's going to be a dramatic shift in working, right? How we do all this kind of stuff. And because it makes sense, if you reduce trade after the revolution, then you're going to have to be producing all those things that you used to import. And from an efficiency standpoint, I think this probably could, there's definitely benefits to saying, well, yeah, let's make more stuff in-house. And he's just kind of calling out, well, these are changes, so just be aware, because it seems that maybe it's that a lot of people he's talking to about this tend to think that like after the revolution, it's just going to be business as usual. But there's definitely change coming.
Yeah, and Public Citizen in my chat here is asking a question that's, or not necessarily a question, but I suppose making an interesting observation, which is, I suppose, somewhat relevant to this. They say here, I didn't know anarchy was so well thought out. Good to know. So what happens when an anarchist and a libertarian meets? No two people are more alike, yet so different in philosophy. I think that's a good observation for sure. I think that there are very different motivations behind like a kind of right-wing libertarian and a kind of anarchist that we're talking about here. But I think that one of the major differences actually is regards to how they think about the division of labor and how they think about the integration of these various kinds of tasks right here. Because Kropotkin clearly thinks that, we need to get rid of these properties that are sort of obscuring our ability to really sort of understand the world. I think that that's like the major idea that he's trying to bring through us, get to us in part 3 here. That, once these industries establish themselves, once we try to have a revolution, these industries are absolutely going to need to exist and are necessary for the sustaining of a revolution, and also, finally, are going to be necessary. And also, I should say, the intellectual revolution is also going to be necessary for the sustaining of the industries sort of themselves. I think that, one of the interesting quotes, like you were sort of bringing up here, is how he says here, quote, "Cultivation of the soil is no longer possible without machinery, without great irrigation, and without works, and without railways, without manure factories." And, Kropotkin thinks that these things are communally owned in a certain way, but that we're still capable of having kind of free exchange, that freedom consists in the proper social arrangement of individuals. I think that libertarians, to get back to the question here, I think libertarians might have a more competitive thought about how social relations work. One of the things that we opened up this book club at the very beginning with, and one of the ideas that Kropotkin is really following through, is that he wants to shift the comments on Darwin. It was oftentimes thought that Darwin's work told us the lesson which we should draw from Darwin is a kind of typical thing you'd hear from social Darwinists, which is that competition is, the way of life, and that's how, iron sharpens iron, and we're going to get the sort of best productivity by having people compete, and that this is sort of a justification for capitalism. Kropotkin says no. Actually, the best way to interpret Darwin is to think of society as here, like we're all in society together, and we're actually competing against the environment. And that's how we should think about the issue of competition, not as competition between individuals, but competition between the environment as such. I think that that's perhaps one of the major differences between the libertarian, right-wing libertarians, and the kind of left-wing anarchists, such as, for instance, Kropotkin or something of the sort. And I think that we're really starting to see that kind of brought in here when he's discussing these ideas of the integration of function, like all of society sort of coming together in order to like truly liberate people in a certain way. I think that it's a little bit of a tangent, but I think that there is something to what we're reading right now relating to that comment there.
Yeah, and I think it's a fantastic comment, because I'll agree. I mean, I think, and I don't know if it's just this country or what, but you grow up thinking anarchy just means buildings are burning and there's murder in the streets and stuff, until, because there's sort of these two uses of the word anarchy. And we even hear politicians like this week and last week using that word anarchist in the completely other sense of the word. And when you sit down and start reading anarchist theory, you go, oh, this is actually really, like, this isn't just some chaos thing that someone thought up. There's actually a lot in here. There's a lot to this. And that comment about how libertarianism and anarchism is so similar and yet so different, I think is actually an outstanding point, because, most of the libertarian arguments I hear always come from a standpoint of ownership. It's like, well, I own this road, so then if you want to drive on this road, you're going to pay me a toll. I own this thing, so I get full say in what happens on this piece of property. Whereas with the anarchism, it's sort of the opposite, which is there isn't this major ownership, right? You don't get to tell someone to drive on this road that they have to pay you specifically, and yet there are some large similarities between the two. Mm-hmm. But I think many of the things called out in this book become problematic when you still have the same people saying, okay, we don't have as many rules, but I'm still the owner. Essentially you have these like mini capitalists that are calling the shots in a libertarian system. And I'm not an expert on libertarianism, but that seems to be kind of an argument that comes up.
It's certainly something in that vein. Pat Owen in the chat saying, give the planet a voice. I think that that's a really good observation. It's one of the concerns that I've raised a few times throughout the course of reading this book, which is that Kropotkin doesn't speak much about the environment. I imagine that has to do with the product of when this book was written. The idea of climate change wasn't even near popular discussion or even really thought of or even dreamt of at the time. And Kropotkin is certainly very interested in maximizing production. He doesn't really seem to have any qualms, at least so far, and at least in this book. I've not read all of Kropotkin's work, and we still have a chapter to go. But he does not seem to have many qualms at all about, just using the environment for the advantage of people. I mean, he does have ideas of sustainability that, if you exploit too much too quickly, you can get into trouble. But that seems to be a kind of anthropocentric, we might say, human-centered kind of concern for the environment, which you might be able to question. You might be able to legitimately raise questions about that. So going through part three a little bit more, he talks a little bit here at the end. I thought that this was a quite beautiful section. I think that it raises the concern that I brought up sort of at the beginning of part three, how he's very interested in how the revolution can sort of remove the things which obscure us from like understanding truth and understanding like the proper modes of justice. He says here, quote, this is sort of towards the end of the chapter. He says here, quote, a revolution is more than a mere change in the prevailing political system. It implies the awakening of human intelligences and the increasing of the inventive spirit tenfold, a hundredfold. It is the dawn of a new science, the science of men like Laplace, Lamarck, and Lavoisier. It is a revolution in the minds of men as deep as and still deeper than in their institutions. And so Kropotkin really and very, very seriously thinks here that like once we remove away the obscurities of bourgeois property, the limitations, we're really going to see our needs as they truly exist. And we'll really be able to develop not only a new science, which he brings up last time, that, you know, we're going to have these scientists who are going to come along. I joked that they were philosopher kings, and I don't know that it's as much of a joke as much as it like they actually are. You know, these like scientists who are going to come along and they're going to tell us like sort of what our needs are, and that these needs are going to, you know, and they're also going to tell us the best way to allocate those needs. There's some general questions there that, you know, it seems like there might be conflicts between the way in which organization occurs and those, you know, what those needs are. There might be needs that are wrapped up in the organization itself. But in any case, Kropotkin thinks that like once these obscurities of properties which are hierarchically imposed upon us are removed, we're really going to be able to understand the best way to sort of live our lives. He gives specific examples of how he says here, quote, this is sort of giving historical examples during previous revolutions. He says here, quote, the revolted city will be compelled to do without these foreigners, and why not? France invented beetroot sugar when sugarcane ran short during the continental blockade. Parisians discovered saltpeter in their cellars when they no longer received any from abroad. Shall we be inferior to our grandfathers who hardly lisped the first words of science? That might be a little bit insulting to their grandfathers and to people before them who were very intelligent. Maybe they weren't doing science in quite the way that you saw them. But Kropotkin thinking there that, you know, like sort of need is going to create the invention. And so, you know, during the course of revolution, or perhaps before it, we're going to, you know, and once we sort of remove these blockades, we're going to really be able to understand the kind of things that we truly need. And this is like, you know, you might criticize that, saying that this is a kind of hand waving. And I think that that's actually fair. Like this is a genuine example of hand waving, but I think that Kropotkin would argue that this hand waving is justified in the sense that he's providing us a kind of blueprint, but he's saying here that like this is how it's going to happen, that like, you know, you remove these obscurities of capital, these hierarchical organizations at the start of a revolution, and because of these necessities built into agriculture and how agriculture properly works, you know, it's going to necessarily sort of work itself out, and that we are going to, through that and through the inventions of intelligent people who, you know, workers now being forced into situations where they're, you know, in a kind of management role, they're forced to, you know, work with their head and their hands for the first time, that there's going to be this kind of explosion of intelligence, and that this is going to be the necessary fuel of the revolution, and that's really going to be sort of what carries us forward. Because if we don't do that, he specifically says here that the revolution will fail. If we don't have the inventive spirit, if we don't get that tenfold invention, spirit of inventiveness, the revolution's going to fail. But he says that it will happen, so don't worry.
Yeah, it's and I kind of had that same interpretation when I read it, which is that it, you know, there are times when he gets not really cheerleader-ish, but like, you know, he's getting a little creative with the prose in order to be a little inspirational and stuff. So yeah, him saying, well, we'll get all those answers on the other end. So there's a little bit of hand waving, but at the same time, that's kind of the point, is once we have all this resource available to us and we're not siphoning it all into a handful of individuals who can become ultra wealthy, then we can we can be more responsive to the needs of a society on a shorter basis by funneling that into the needs of that society, and we can react in that way. And I think that's part of what would come from this ability to be when we put the human mind to work and we're able to achieve the stuff he's talking about, the art and the creativity and all this kind of stuff, we can improve things in a way that just isn't possible right now, because that sort of all that creative work is being siphoned off for the benefit of the few. Yeah.
He says at the very end here, we need write no fiction to prove this. What we are sure of, what has already been experimented upon and recognized as practical would suffice to carry it into effect if the attempt were fertilized, vivified by the daring inspiration of the revolution and the spontaneous impulse of the masses. What a beautiful way to end a section there. But I think, again, we're seeing this idea of the kind of unity of knowledge that we saw again, or that we saw previously with the scientists. That there's the needs aren't going to contradict one another. That if we truly understand people's needs, we really understand the best way that in the most efficient way to allocate those things. That needs aren't going to come into contradiction with one another. I think again we see that idea being played out again in that particular chapter. Through the theme of chapter 16, and especially quite clearly there in part 3. So do you have anything to add to this, or are we moving on next to the final chapter, chapter 17, next week?
Yeah, I think we're ready for that agriculture for next week, and then we'll announce, sounds like we'll announce a book next week probably.
Yeah, so next week, since this is the final chapter, chapter 17 is the final chapter, so next week we'll be going through chapter 17. We will also be announcing the next book that we'll be reading. We still have to figure it out. We actually don't know yet, so it's not like we're just holding you all in suspense. We also have to figure it out for ourselves. A few comments here. Public Citizen saying here, wow, this is very scary stuff to the establishment. Could America survive without another revolution? That's a really good question. You're right. It's definitely very scary stuff to the establishment. I'm not exactly sure. Like, I will say this, Public Citizen, when people say the establishment, and I admit that I use the term, I'm never sure what they mean, because like everybody uses the word establishment and everybody has a different meaning for the word establishment. But I think you're right to say no matter who you mean by the establishment, scary stuff for them.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this would definitely turn things on its head if you started to take some of these ideas into effect. It would remove the power that a handful of people have, and obviously those are the people with the most resources, so they're used to being in control and don't want to lose that. So yeah, it would absolutely turn things on their head, to the point that I think even many of the people who would benefit from it, it's such a vast change, I don't know that you could even convince those people that it's in their best interest. Just because people tend to get set in their ways, and they'll we see this right now, right? People fighting for politics that are actually working against them, and yet they'll scream to defend it,
Well, I think that this actually relates directly to some of the points that Kropotkin's making, that, we do have definite needs. And I think that is a debatable point, right? Like, I mean, again, that is specifically Kropotkin's thesis. He doesn't necessarily argue for that, but it does seem to be the case, at least to me. And I'll sort of put my biases here on the table. I don't know that people have singular needs. I think it's more that we have a variety of different sorts of needs, and people can be, through persuasion and through ideas, start to see their needs differently.
Right.
And those needs, not necessarily that like people are always tricked or deceived about their true needs. I think that does sometimes happen, and certainly that can be the intention of people exploiting people, right? You try to get how they see their needs to align with what your desires are in a certain way, right? And that can serve as a kind of exploitation. But my view is that, you think about it sort of like a die, like if I have a die, right, and I have a bunch of different dots on it, if I ask you, well, how many dots are on the die? Well, you could answer all the dots added up, but if I roll the die, I can only see a few of the sides. I can't see all the sides of the die at the same time as much as I might try. And so, it might be something like that, that maybe, it's about how you look at our desires and how you look at our needs, how you think about it, that tells you sort of how you're going to react. So anyway, just a couple 2 cents closing thoughts.
Well, let me just respond to that, because I think it's a good point. And as Anarcho Taco points out here, there's the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it seems like there's one end of the spectrum where we could all agree, right? What you need: food, water, shelter, stuff like that. Few people are going to argue that those aren't needs, even though we see cities in this country where you can't get good running water in your pipes and stuff. So there's kind of those basics. But then the further you move through that, I mean, there are people in this country that sort of apparently think shelter isn't even a need, that it's perfectly fine to have a growing homeless population in the country. And then you get into issues where it's even more contentious, where, people have specific needs to them, and other people want to deny that. They want to deny, someone else's identity, or they want to deny some other thing. And yet to that person, that is a need to be considered legitimate in their view of themselves. And so, yeah, the further you get away from those sort of survival needs in that hierarchy of needs, there certainly is going to be some disagreement on what is actually a need and what is valid and that kind of stuff. And so, that would be very difficult, I think, for our country to get through a situation like that.
I will say this. Look, I'm not an expert on Maslow. I've hardly read any of Maslow's. I think I've read like one essay or one paper from him. As long as Maslow doesn't mean like a necessary sort of temporal hierarchy in terms of you must fulfill this before, in which he doesn't, by the way.
Right.
He doesn't mean that. There is some legitimacy to saying that like some needs are more basic than other needs. I think that that's like perfectly reasonable. But I think it's also the case that our social needs are just as basic as any of our other needs. People don't sleep as well when they're lonely. Mm-hmm. So, you say sleep is a basic need. Well, hold on. If it's the case that I can't sleep if I don't have close friends, then what do you mean to say that sleep is a more basic need than my close relationship with friends? Perhaps all of our needs are wrapped up. If I'm not eating well, I probably can't sleep well either. In fact, not just that. If I'm not eating well, then I probably can't socialize particularly well with my friends either. And it also turns out that, like having good friends is helpful and reliable for getting good shelter, getting good safety, and the like. Again, I don't know enough about Maslow to comment specifically on Maslow's work. I really don't. I'd like to. He's definitely a thinker that I want to spend more time with. Hopefully next year, the start of next year, he's kind of on my schedule to get a grasp of. But I think that we have to be careful about saying that there's like a direct priority and we can sort of rank order our needs. I think that it's always important to think about people as holistic beings and try to work around that and think about things in the abstract and then move to the particulars maybe.